Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of the PFF NFL podcast betting show. We've got actual 2024 football to react to and to look ahead with. So I'm Ben Linsey. Judah Fortgang is with me. How you doing, Judah? How's your weekend, man?
I'm doing great. As you said, there's that incredible excitement of getting the first bits of obviously new film. But for us data nerds, also being able to load in new data set, new play-by-play, absolutely love it. Also, just a pretty interesting week of football, I thought. Something everyone's talking about, quarterback play. It's not good. Not a lot of passing yards. I think one of the other interesting takeaways is it was a great reminder of the fragility of defenses. The Browns were this incredible unit last year and were just bad against the Cowboys and could not generate any pressure. The Jets have been this incredible defense for 2 years and just could not stop the run, could not even stop the pass. I mean, San Francisco was scoring at will, and it's just a good reminder of how quickly things changed in the league, right? The things that passing was so successful, and now it's a little bit less so. Defenses that were so good in the past, just you flip the switch, and all of a sudden it almost feels like nothing's the same. It's remarkable how quickly this league changes.
Yeah, the Jets one killed me. I bought in. I believed in the defense, and you're just sitting there watching Jordan Mason shove it down their throat repeatedly. That was a tough way to end the week. But our Lions, it wasn't how I imagined it, but a cover is a cover, and they got it done in overtime.
When it was 17-3, I'm look at us. We were pumping up the Lions here. Everything is going well. The Rams just look completely inept. Everyone's hurt, and they kind of just crawl back. But hey, great teams cover, and that's what the Lions did for us.
I'm going to chalk that one up to Stafford just absolutely putting them on his back. He was incredible that game. But let's move on. Let's look ahead to week 2. We got some good matchups here. Again, the format we're kind of rolling with for this show is we're going to look at 4 of the bigger games of the week more in depth, kind of talk through how we think these matchups are going to play out, what we think kind of the angles could be, and then wrap it up at the end with some other spots around the league that we like. I know you've got some of your same game parlays that you're famous for to come at the end of the show. I've got some stuff around key insights we're building out for the product team that should be rolling out as some betting tools available on pff.com. And then we'll wrap it up that way. But let's get things started with Bills-Dolphins, divisional game. 2 teams who are in the mix for postseason coming into the year. How do you think this one plays out on a short week?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting spot because we have almost a pretty decent sample of these teams of the Bills are kind of who we think they are. We're now at game 5 of Tua and McDaniel against this Bills team. And I think this is the first time that the market's really kind of clinging to the Dolphins here, which I think is an interesting spot. I think there are a lot of central questions almost. Fewer answers, more questions. And one is we saw Joe Brady, the offensive coordinator that replaced Ken Dorsey around week 12, I believe, last season, kind of implemented a very run-heavy approach. They were passing 10% below expected. Was expected, it accounts for certain situations. Obviously, when you're up 21-0, you are much more likely to run than if you're down 21-0. So adjusting for those kind of contextual factors, the Bills rushed 7.5% less than expected, one of the bottom marks in the league, which is particularly puzzling when Josh Allen's the quarterback. I'm curious if they stick with that against a pretty vulnerable Miami team. And then I think on the other side of the ball, one of the main points is Miami going to be able to run the ball at all? Raheem Mostert's ruled out. Devon Achane, if he plays, is definitely banged up. They struggled to run the ball last week. Their guards are not particularly great. I'm curious if they can run the ball at all, and frankly, if it even matters. Are the Dolphins going to be able to kind of pass their way through it?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest lean I have on this game is I think Miami just looks to attack the Bills' pass defense with their stars because 2 of the guys who are getting a lot of touches that you mentioned, Mostert and Achane, are out and game time decision, right? And I think what makes this angle enticing to me is you look at the Bills defense. They actually did a pretty good job against Miami last year, I thought, but a lot of moving pieces, especially over the middle of the field where we know Miami wants to hammer, right? Matt Milano, one of the better linebackers in the league, out for potentially the year with a biceps injury. So you're replacing him. Teron Johnson, your starting nickel cornerback, missed week 1. He's on the injury report again. You're replacing both of your starting safeties with Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer. And that's exactly that kind of layer between the linebackers and the safeties is exactly where Miami wants to attack. They're one of the best teams in the league at it. I was kind of looking at linebacker and safety grades against certain offenses, and the clear top 3 offenses in the league at making linebackers and safeties look bad: Miami, San Francisco, Detroit, right? And that's an area that they pepper. Tua had 101 targets last year between the numbers, 10 to 19 yards downfield, so that intermediate range. And I think they're just going to pepper Waddle and Hill with targets. And I think, honestly, Buffalo is going to have trouble stopping it.
Yeah, no, that's. I think I was alluding to it a little bit when mentioning like the Dolphins are going to struggle, I think, running the ball, or that's one of the kind of central questions. And like, does it matter because they can pass their way through? And I think it's exactly that. I mean, like, Teron Johnson's also set to miss this game. He's been a terrific slot for him. And I think when you're kind of getting into a lot more of the nitty gritty weeds of like building an SGP, for example, where you want to layer in your fundamentals, of course, of just like how good are the teams, is the market pricing the yardage properly. One, it's like, okay, where's the volume going to go? And let's look into kind of the intricacies of a matchup and see like where does that favor a particular receiver. And to me, that's like, this is more a Jalen Waddle game than a Tyreek Hill game. Right, Hill's going to really beat you on the outside. I mean, he can beat you anywhere, but the way Jalen Waddle is utilized is on a lot of these crossing routes that are attacking the middle of the field, where he can kind of generate a lot of yards after the catch. I think if the Dolphins are going to have a ton of success throwing the ball, I mean, they can do it with Tyreek Hill. He's good enough to beat anyone. But I think if they're playing into the strength of the matchups that we're talking about is like a little bit more likely to happen, I think it happens through Waddle. And when I'm thinking about building out this game, I think of if the Dolphins are going to have success passing, and I think they're going to have to pass the ball because the running game is going to struggle. I like that kind of angle of Tua to Jalen Waddle, and there's a big gap in how the market's pricing Jalen Waddle versus Tyreek Hill. And I think to your point about the middle of the field here, this spot actually really favors Jalen Waddle.
Yeah, Waddle it's interesting because he's kind of viewed as like a vertical speed threat, but I think he's really good in those kind of tight window contested situations over the middle of the field. And to your point, that's how they use him. And Tyreek Hill's matchup proof, right? There's no matchup where I'm afraid of Tyreek Hill not producing. But like you said, the market reflects that. Waddle, when I was looking yesterday, 63.5. Tyreek was up over 90. So you're getting more value there with Waddle, and I like that angle as well. On the other side of the ball with Buffalo, if we're talking about kind of these core pieces on Miami's offense going off, do you think Buffalo is able to keep pace, right, and kind of force them to keep pushing the pedal with their passing offense?
Yeah, I think it's almost ironic because we're talking about like Joe Brady running the ball more, but I think like the entirety of this offense hinges on Josh Allen. I think more so than any other team in the league, they are like one player dependent. And like you even see that in how they're deploying their wide receivers. Like no one had more than 5 targets last week. It was Keon Coleman who led the team, and then there were just like 7 guys with 2 to 3 targets. They're really rotating their receivers. I don't think it's like, oh, we need to rely on like some secondary matchup. It's really a question of like, can Josh Allen keep up? I think what's lost a little bit in last week was like the Jaguars had a ton of success throwing the ball downfield. The Dolphins allowed a bunch of explosive plays. There was a DPI on Brian Thomas. There were some other big drops on the Jaguars side of the ball. And like, we know.
By the way, that Trevor Lawrence throw, the touchdown throw, was absolutely absurd.
Pristine. That's what gets me with Trevor Lawrence and why I can't quit. But nonetheless, I think that the Bills, like, they can overcome anything because in the same way that Tyreek Hill is matchup proof, like Josh Allen's matchup agnostic, right? If you're going to throw a great pressure front against Allen, he's going to be able to extend the play, mitigate the pressure, avoid sacks, and still kind of churn along. And that's the Dolphins surprisingly generated plenty of pressure in week 1. I thought that would kind of take a step back given their personnel, given that they lost Vic Fangio. That did not seem to be the case. But I think Josh Allen is like, he's matchup agnostic. And I think it's going to be kind of a feeling out process of like, where's that production going to come from? I just kind of wish that they let him throw the ball a little bit more, let him use his legs, or just even drop back, let him scramble. That's fine. But fewer carries to James Cook, I think would give me a little bit more reason to believe in the Bills offense, but it's Josh Allen. Anything can happen.
And I'm with you in that the Bills are going to have to run things through the passing game. One, because I think Miami's going to be putting up a lot of points, right? If that's kind of a belief, but also the Bills, there was a lot of talk when they drafted Dalton Kincaid last year about, okay, you paid Dawson Knox. How is this going to work? You were kind of a spread offense. Now you've got 2 tight ends that you want on the field. And Knox got hurt last year. There was they were in 12 personnel a lot, and they went away from it, and then they went back to it a little bit. You look at what they did week 1. They were 46% of their plays were in 12 personnel, which is basically what that stands for. Is 1 running back on the field, 2 tight ends on the field. And the interesting thing about Buffalo when they're in 12 personnel is neither of those guys are really great blockers, right? So defenses almost kind of treated it like there was still 3 wide receivers on the field in terms of what they were matching up with. But Buffalo struggled to run the ball when they had those 2 tight ends on the field. If you look at James Cook's yards per carry since the start of last year, in 12, 3.5 yards per carry, in 11, 4.9 yards per carry. And there's going to be some difference there generally, just because when you're more spread, yards per carry typically goes up because it's not short yardage and all of that stuff. But I do think it's a situation where Buffalo's going to have to put up points. I think they're going to struggle to run the ball against Miami, and it's going to be a situation where if they want to keep pace, they're going to have to lean on Allen, both with his arm and then his ability to create as a scrambler.
Yeah, and like that's got to be the story of the Bills this year, no? Like I feel like we'll be saying this time and time again. It's just like they're going to rely on Josh Allen, and that's kind of how it's going to go. But he can do it.
All right, just to summarize, kind of before we flip the page, what kind of angles are you on this game? What's your favorite sort of a way to attack it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be with Tua to Waddle. I like this as an SGP build. I think it works kind of both ways with the spread. I can see this happening in multiple different types of game scripts, but it's just taking advantage of. I think this matchup like really lends itself to Jalen Waddle on a crossing route, and if he's going to break one. I feel like I've seen this video like 1,000 times in my head. It was like Odell Beckham back in the day, and now it's just Jalen Waddle of like him passing a ball perfectly in stride over the middle of the field and running it like 65 yards upfield. That's my preferred way of attacking. Just given like obviously Tyreek Hill's incredible, the market's caught up to that. I think there's a little bit too wide a gap right now in those props. I'm going to be betting on the 2 alts and SGPing that with Waddle.
Yeah, I'm going to be with you, and I'm also going to be on James Cook's under rushing, just because of kind of what I outlined. So it sounds like we're in kind of lockstep there, but I think this next game might be more of a discussion based on what we talked about pre-pod. We're going to Cowboys Saints, Tom Brady's second broadcasting game. So both teams coming off blowout wins. All right, Dallas over Cleveland, New Orleans over Carolina. How do you think this one plays out?
Yeah, this is super interesting to me. One of the bigger surprises in week 1, and like this comes with the caveat of like they were playing the Panthers. So it's possible this is just a function of the Panthers, but I anticipated the Saints offensive line being dreadful. And this was the top ranked pass blocking unit by our rankings. And that's a little bit of a different story when you're going up against Micah Parsons. I mean, they absolutely dominated the Browns offensive line. I know you have some data there, but I think that's like a real question and it's almost a proxy question of like, how good is Clint Kubiak as an offensive coordinator? I think one of the more interesting recent developments, I'm actually curious your thoughts on this, is that among the kind of new wave of offensive coordinators, guys that have had a lot of success in the last bunch of years, the Kyle Shanahan's, Matt LaFleur, like they've done a great job of mitigating pressure and finding ways to scheme their quarterbacks such that like you're not reliant on the offensive line doing a great job. And if the Saints can have a lot of success there, or if like the offensive line is just good, which is possible, but I think unlikely, then this spot to me is like completely mispriced. The line's set at 6.5 right now. And I think a lot of that kind of reflects the Panthers game. And it's just like, oh, the Panthers are bad. But I see this game playing out a little differently. If the Saints can kind of like continue to utilize motion, if they can continue to utilize play action, kind of get the linebackers to take a step back, not just dig their cleats in and go in for some pass rush snaps, I think this is a different Saints offense, and they definitely have weapons. I've long talked about Rashid Shaheed, self-proclaimed president of the fan club, but Chris Olave is like top 5 in separation every single year by our counts. They have weapons. If they can kind of utilize this scheme and mitigate what the Cowboys can do on the pass rush, they're a very vulnerable secondary. I don't think Deshaun Watson is able to take advantage of that, but I kind of see that going both ways. Of like, if the Saints team is this kind of new wave of offensive coordinator, I think they'll have plenty of success on offense. If it's just like, okay, that was a 1-week anomaly, and like it's Michael Parsons against a bad offensive line, that itself can wreck the game. I think it works both ways.
That's really the fundamental question, right? Is the Saints offensive line against the Cowboys pass rush, how much you weight what happened in week 1? Because like you said, Derek Carr was pressured on 3 of 25 dropbacks. How much of that was the Panthers don't have a pass rush and they got a big lead early? And there are some underlying scheme elements that you mentioned, right? You saw a lot more motion. You saw a lot more play action. That was things that the Saints didn't do in previous years, right? They were kind of still living in the world where you have Drew Brees and he's just a human computer and he's able to get the ball out to the right place every time. And that's not the case anymore. And if you're going up against Dallas, that pass rush can make good offensive lines look bad. Right? And I think my take on this game is Dallas last week, 43% pressure rate, 18 quarterback knockdowns. And it's a situation where if the Saints have a weak point on the offensive line, Mike Zimmer is going to find it with Micah Parsons. He is not a TJ Watt who's lined up over right tackle on 90+% of his snaps. Dallas moves him around. He has 150+ pass rush snaps last year on the left side, on the right side, and between the tackles. And you saw that some against Dallas where he's in that spinner role lined up over a guard or over the center. And I know the Saints offensive line looked good in week 1. And I know that there's reasons that they can mitigate pressure if they're doing some of this stuff. I don't have faith in Trevor Penning at right tackle, Fuaga at left tackle in his second start. Left guard's a question mark. Lucas Patrick started there for a run, but he went down with an injury. I just think that there's too many places that Dallas can attack and get free rushers through stunts. They do that a ton too. And I think it's a situation where Carr is going to be feeling a lot more pressure than he did in week 1. And we've seen in the past, that's not something he responds well to. He does not necessarily want to stand in there and deliver. He's going to check the ball down. And he's going to throw the ball away. And I think we've seen this story with Derek Carr against a good pass rush. And I'm going to bet on Dallas being able to get home.
Yeah, first off, it took you 17 minutes until we started listing the depth chart. I'm a little disappointed. I was expecting some more exotic names like 5 minutes in. But I think kind of the like point here that I want to emphasize is that there are almost 2 ways to win, so to speak, on the offensive line. You could just like be better and win your one-on-one matchups. And there's also this element of effectively like eliminating that part from the game. I think the best example of this is the Dolphins. But just like they haven't had a particularly great offensive line, or at least their pass production hasn't been great. But they have designed an offense such that Tua can get rid of the ball in 2.2 seconds and do so like 10 yards down the field, right? The way they utilize motion, the way they have so much speed. And I think the point here is like if Kubiak can kind of basically mitigate pressure such that like the individual matchups don't even matter, that's what's like kind of getting me excited. And it's almost like a bet less so in the personnel than like, oh, there's actually like, and because of the way of these underlying schematic elements, there's actually a realm of possibility that like it's not that their personnel was just so much better, but actually there's something schematic. And that I have a little bit more faith in. But as you said, like at the end of the day, there's only that can only go so far. You're still going to have Mike Zimmer kind of getting Micah Parsons in advantageous spots. And also, like, it could be a 1 week anomaly, and like he's not some offensive genius. But I think it's interesting just kind of like tying it back to where the market's at and where there's maybe some asymmetric risk, and I think it does kind of lie in that angle.
Yeah, it's a situation where it's only 1 week, right? And if the Saints are one of these offenses, like I'm kind of on the side of it's 1 week. I'm not ready to say Kubiak is Mike McDaniel in that regard. And Zimmer on the other side does a really good job of disguising looks and showing pressure and backing out and all that stuff as well. But if it is the case moving forward where Kubiak is going to eliminate pressure through scheme, this is a situation to bet on it, right? If that's your belief, this is a perfect situation to bet on it.
Yeah, I just want to highlight this point as like more of a general betting point of like, you can always kind of bet on the things that you think are most likely to happen. That's like betting on spreads. And the reason why I so often go into alts is because I like to bet on things that are wider out in the distribution, things that are almost like trying to navigate like the risk profiles, to kind of use some like financial terminology here. And to me, when I think about this game, I think about how it can kind of play out in a whole bunch of different ways. And the market, I think, is going to have a little bit more difficult a time of projecting things that are like either 30% likely or 70% likely in their terms than things that are 50% likely. And that's why I think we can kind of get to a lot of interesting discussion, is because like there are so many layers of the game, and there's like a game within a game. And I'll actually use that as like a springboard to talk about kind of a new thing I think we want to do on this show of just like PFF has done a ton of incredible data studies and work in general. And I think we want to kind of utilize a lot of those findings in placing bets. I think these are also precisely the spots where the market is not pricing it in correctly. We have our own data that's not publicly available. It's not available to the books. These are the sorts of angles I think are like perfect to highlight. And one of these was a study that was done on man coverage. So when you kind of look at man coverage versus zone coverage, I believe there were two studies. The one I'm referring to is should teams play more man or zone? We can link that in the show notes. And effectively what he was saying was in man coverage as opposed to zone coverage, the better player wins out more often. There's a lot of noise in zone coverage. It's not this kind of like one-on-one battle. But in man, when you have a better wide receiver going up against a better corner, it's much more likely that he's going to win than in zone coverage. And not just that, it is also more likely that that player, in the sense it obviously follows, that player is going to get more targets. So their targets are much more predictable in man coverage than zone. And I bring this up because this is a Dallas team, and I wasn't so sure heading into last week because they changed their defensive coordinators. Dan Quinn's obviously in Washington now. But this is a team that still played plenty of man coverage, and they don't have great covered cornerbacks. And why I think that matters and why I think we can layer it on top of the angle that we just mentioned of the offensive line play and why I really love the alts here is that the Saints wide receivers had a massive matchup advantage. Trevon Diggs has been great on ball, but has been a bottom 20th percentile cornerback in separation prevented. And Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed over the last 3 years are both top 10 in separation and even better in separation against man coverage. And the Cowboys are going to be playing a ton of man. We can expect those guys to get the ball, probably Olave more so than Shaheed. And we can also expect those guys to win a little more sustainably than it would be if it were zone coverage. I think that's true of the Saints. I think it also be true of the Cowboys too.
Yeah, I would assume as the season progresses, we'll see Zimmer go back to more zone, right? I think in Minnesota, he was more of a kind of disguised zone coverage defense rather than the heavy man we saw with Dan Quinn in Dallas the last few years. But using that man coverage thing as a segue, I love the Dallas offense because of exactly that reason. The Saints are a heavy man coverage team, and Dallas has shredded man coverage. Most yards per dropback for his man coverage since the start of 2023. Dallas and San Francisco at 8.3. Minnesota's next closest at 7.6. And Dak and CD in particular. Dak first in passing yards against man since the start of last season. CD first in receiving yards against man since the start of last season. And I don't think it's a bad group for the Saints with Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo, but Dallas is so good at moving CD around. You saw them putting him in motion. He got a couple handoffs on jet sweeps in week 1 against the Browns. They're going to find ways to get him into advantageous matchups, and Dak is going to find him. And I think that the Cowboys are going to have a lot of success through the air in this matchup.
Yeah, no, I love that. And what I think is great is that two things can equally be true. But like, I can make this case for the Saints, both because I'm like hitting a different side of the distribution, and also like there's this game within a game, and like this angle can hit precisely, and like the main part of the game, i.e. betting on a thing like a spread, the two are not mutually exclusive. And I totally agree. There's like, it really fits into a lot of kind of the core research. Like, there is no one to cover CeeDee Lamb in man coverage, and certainly no one on the Saints is capable of doing that. I think that's a great angle.
So just to wrap up kind of our thoughts on this game, I think Dallas has a clear advantage in the passing game when they're on offense. I think the Dallas pass rushes, though, is going to impact Derek Carr. The Saints are going to struggle on offense. So I'm kind of hesitant to go big on Dak and CD because of a situation like we saw last week in Cleveland, where the first half, right, Dak to CD, that was working well, but then you're up 30 points and you don't need to keep passing. The one element I like on the Saints side that I didn't hit because of what I think is going to happen in terms of Dallas being able to get pressure on Carr, I like Alvin Kamara over 4.5 receptions is what I saw it at yesterday. I actually bet that in week 1 against Carolina, and it was the worst game script imaginable, and it hit. He got 5 receptions. So if the Saints are playing catch up against a good pass rush, I'm going to go back to the well.
Yeah, they ran so many plays, even just by virtue of having such a huge lead that does work. I think my main angle here is this Olave Carr Saints spread. I think that there is a world of possibility where like Clint Kubiak's the real deal, and I think this is a Saints passing offense that can have a lot of success. And this Cowboys defense is pretty vulnerable, I think, if the pass rush can't get home. And Chris Olave's got a 30% target share against man. He's going to basically every metric you can come up with, he's going to be at the top there. I think there's a real kind of all to play right there.
Just to wrap up, speaking of Kubiak, shout out to Michael Byrne. Was working with us on some of the broadcast stuff, just took a job as an analyst with the Saints. So for his sake, hopefully this game can stay competitive. Moving on to our next matchup. One of the bigger matchups of the last few seasons, to be honest. Bengals Chiefs. And the Bengals, woof, week 1, going against New England, taking an L. I know, very popular survivor pick. Luckily, I was on Seattle, but a tough one there. And that's something we've seen with the Bengals in recent years is them coming out of the gate slow. And whether that's a Burrow's been hurt in the preseason thing, they haven't had all their players through training camp, whatever it is, they've gone out of the gate slow the last couple of years. Do you think it's something they can turn around in this matchup against the Chiefs?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think there has to be some concern. There has to be some concern about Burrow, but I'm not a doctor. I don't want to speculate on injury. I'm in no position to, and I don't think really anyone knows, except for people who actually have the information. But what I think is different about this team is that, like, it's not the same offense, especially not if T. Higgins is playing. Jamar Chase is banged up. He's clearly not fully healthy. The defense is not the same. They've also kind of, like, lost pieces. They were a disaster on pass defense at the end of last season. It's not the same Bengals team, I don't think. And if you look at the other side, the Chiefs to me are a complete different story of like, they're not the same team and in the best possible way. When you look at the grand scheme of how offenses operate and how quickly you want to upgrade teams, that's I think kind of the central question of like where we are in the season of like week 2, and it's gonna be true in week 3 and week 4 of like how much do you wait what happened in the past, how much do you wait what has already transpired this season. And I think for the Chiefs, you want to be very quick to adjust that like this team is almost kind of back to like a little more of their explosive ways. And Mahomes' ADOT is still shallow, but they're sprinkling in plenty of these deep shots. And I'm just much more comfortable comfortable is not the right word. I think it's much more valuable to upgrade the Chiefs offense and not just say, the Bengals are starting slow. This is like classic narrative. This is a different team. And they're going up against a Chiefs defense that also plays plenty of man coverage. And like Trent McDuffie has quietly turned into, dare I say it, a superstar. He has been absolutely terrific ever since coming into the league. Joshua Williams too has been great. Like they have pieces. And especially when Jamar Chase is not fully healthy, the Bengals secondary options are not what they used to be. I don't see this as a parallel situation to years prior.
Yeah, I was kind of, when I was looking into this game and trying to think through how it would play out, I was kind of struggling. And then I looked at the week one kind of quarterback profiles for Mahomes and Burrow. If you look stylistically, very similar. Mahomes 6.0 yard ADOT, 2.66 second time to throw. Burrow 5.9 ADOT, 2.64 second time to throw. Mahomes is obviously much more successful, 10.4 yards per attempt. Burrow 5.7. And I think the point I'm trying to make there is what Kansas City was doing against Baltimore just made a lot of sense. Right? They were trying to spread the field and get Rashee Rice one-on-ones on the inside. Right? You saw a lot of times where either by formation or by kind of stacking him, they were getting him these one-on-one situations against slot corners, against linebackers, where it was a simple slant or an in-breaking route over the middle of the field, an option route, and you were getting him the ball on kind of what we chart as horizontal leads with yards after the catch opportunities. You compare that to what the Bengals are doing. It's a lot more stick routes, short hitches, screen passes where you don't get that yards after the catch opportunity. And I just don't think they have – I don't necessarily trust either of these teams' like vertical passing attack. I know we talked about that going in with Kansas City as potentially something they opened up. Didn't see a ton of it in week one. Right? So I think they're probably going to try to win in similar ways to what we saw through the playoffs last year with that yards after the catch in the run game. With the Bengals, I think they need that vertical element more just because they can't live in that world where you're taking these 5-yard gains. And then if you make a mistake, the series is over. Right? So I have faith in Kansas City's ability to get the ball to Rice, his ability to pick up yards after the catch, less so in Cincinnati's ability to consistently move the ball with the way they're playing right now on offense.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think it's almost like to put my football like watching hat on and taking the analytics off so to speak, of like you even see Mahomes was hitting like Rice in stride multiple times where he just like catches the ball and is already gained 4 yards after the catch before you can blink. So I guess my question here is like, how much of that do you think has to do with like Xavier Worthy and the deep threat that he provides? Is it something else schematically that like Andy Reid is doing? Because like in theory, this should have happened last year too, right? There's no reason why they couldn't design these plays to Rice earlier. Like, did you see something that's changed, or are they just putting him in better spots to succeed?
I think it did happen at the end of last year. We talked a little bit last week about Rice and how they brought him along slowly. But when I was watching week one specifically, they were doing a good job of spreading things out. So I think it was formationally, right? So the spreading things out is one part of that, but also just kind of getting him in stacks. They do that with Kelsey a lot too, especially the last few years. You used to see Kelsey when they would go 3-by-1, so 3 receivers on one side and an isolated receiver on the other. Kelsey was he was their X receiver. He was the guy you're asking to win one-on-one. But as you've gotten later into his career, they're using him more in stacks to get free releases and separation at the line of scrimmage so he can get into his route and create separation there. And I think they're doing similar things with Rice now. So it's Andy Reid's good, man. It really comes down to that.
Yeah, but that's I think kind of precisely the point of like you want to trust Reid, you want to trust Mahomes, and I don't think you can say the same about the Bengals right now, and that's why I kind of I lean Chiefs here.
Yeah, and I think it's a good Pacheco spot too, right? I'm kind of under the assumption that the Chiefs are going to be able to control the game, and Ramondre Stevenson just ran for 120 yards on 20 carries, and you got Jerome Mayo saying take him to the hill, just punish him physically. And the Chiefs, like, they are a very pass-heavy team, but they have more trust in their run game now than they did in prior years, right? So if they're in a situation where the Bengals are susceptible, I think they're going to feed Pacheco as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, I mean, like DJ Reader, there was some crazy splits for the Bengals rush defense with Reader in versus out. Obviously, he's on the Lions now, and they struggled in week 1. But I think it kind of dovetails very well with the points about the Chiefs' explosive attack and their ability to run the ball, which is that I think a lot of the view now is like, oh, the Chiefs can't win with margin. And it's like, oh, I don't know if I want to bet the Chiefs at like 5.5 because they don't win games big. I think that when the offense is much more explosive, and again, that doesn't just mean explosive as like, to your point of like vertical passing 30 yards downfield, it can also mean explosive as like 10-yard, crossers or 8-yard slants, which have like great yards after the catch opportunity. And I think that when you are less reliant on marching down the field and like can score very quickly, it's a lot easier to score points, obviously. But I think that like affects the margin. And to your point of just like, this is a team that I think can like run the ball. And I think certainly has a appealing matchup against the Bengals rush defense, which struggles. And I'm much more fine than previous seasons of kind of like taking the Chiefs with margin here. And I think that's kind of to like take my view of this game. Like, I think that's my favorite angle. Is just like, I talk a lot about all these like alt angles and this, but like when it comes down to it, when you look at the teams that are like what is most likely to happen, and I take an overall fundamental view here, I see the Chiefs as a team that is far more stable, and I'm much more willing to back. And I think the matchup really plays into their strengths. I like the Chiefs at 5.5.
Yeah, and to recap what I'm thinking on this game, I like Rashee Rice. I also like the under on. I saw it at 47.5 yesterday. I think these are two teams who want to kind of move the ball down efficiently, but we're not going to see a ton of big plays. And I think there's going to be some drives that eat clock. So I don't think we're going to get into a shootout necessarily, just because I don't have a ton of faith in the Cincy offense.
Yeah, no, that's how it goes.
Cool. Let's wrap up our kind of in-depth game recaps with the Monday night game. Two interesting teams, both coming off the Eagles coming off a win against the Packers, which that was the game that in my opinion, the Packers probably should have won that game. Jalen Hurts tried to give them a few opportunities to win that game in the fourth quarter. They didn't take it. And the Falcons coming off a loss against Pittsburgh, where their offense did not look like what we thought this offense was going to look like coming into the year. So how do you see them kind of rebounding or not rebounding against the Eagles in this matchup?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I'm not sure if like Cousins is just cooked and like cannot move in the pocket. And like like people like to joke about like, oh, he's an immobile quarterback. And like, there's a huge difference between like actually just like being a statue and like the inability to kind of manipulate the pocket as opposed to a guy who's not going to run, but is at least kind of moving around. I think this plays out a bunch of different ways. I think it would not be surprising to say like, okay, that's a bunch of noise. Like, it's results oriented. TJ Watt just like wrecked that game. The offensive line really struggled. And this is going to be a totally different situation. We talked about the Eagles pass rush last week. They did not do a particularly great job of generating pressure. Again, that is definitely a function of the way LaFleur has schemed out pressure. But like we saw this in the end of last year, it's not a team that is living up to the on paper talent. And like, I think that's going to matter a lot for Kirk because I don't think he can move very well. And if he has time to throw, which he seemingly did not last week, I think he had the 5th quickest time to throw. I think we can see a very different style of offense. But I think kind of my concerns remain of like what I said in the offseason about this team is I think there's like, it might be a fantasy driven narrative of like Drake London and Kyle Pitts are these incredible like wideouts with a ton of hype, and it was Arthur Smith's fault that like they weren't producing. It's like maybe it's also true that like if they were really, really good, they probably would have been able to like overcome that circumstance. I don't know. Like the best players have a way of doing that, and they have zero depth outside of that. I mean, like Ray McCloud was their leading receiver. Got Darnell Mooney. I think he's a nice deep.
Can we talk about Ray McCloud wearing 34?
I don't know what's up with that. The fact that Ray McCloud is catching passes on an NFL roster in 2024 was already shocking to me. That just kind of adds to it. But yeah, it's just not it's not a good secondary cast. Especially if Drake London isn't living up to the billing, and if Kyle Pitts isn't living up to the billing, this is a bad offense. And especially if Kirk Cousins is just having to get rid of the ball quick and there's no one earning separation quickly, I think that's a problem for the Falcons.
I want to have faith that it improves, right? Because I think Zach Robinson is the smart guy coming from PFF, spending a lot of time with Sean McVay. It almost reminds me when you look at the week 1 numbers, which are kind of crazy. You mentioned the fifth fastest time to throw, but just what they were doing kind of by design. They 2 snaps under center, which was second lowest to only Indianapolis. They ran 0 play action. And you think about Kirk Cousins and you think about kind of that Rams tree. I know the Rams have moved away from it a little bit, but it's under center play action. And that's what Kirk Cousins does well. And it almost it reminds me of what we saw from the Bengals early last year when they were protecting Burrow with his calf injury. And I think you're seeing something similar with Atlanta here, where you want them in shotgun or pistol, right? And it was basically when they were running, they were in pistol. When they were passing, they were in shotgun, which is not great in the NFL to have a tendency that's that noticeable. But that's what happened in week 1. And you want him getting rid of the ball quickly. And I don't think that's the optimal formula for this offense. And Philly, I know the pass rush wasn't great in week 1, but they have a good pass rush. You saw Pittsburgh, TJ Watt was in the backfield consistently. And there's just not a ton of big playability to the point where, like we were talking about with the Bengals, if you want to play that way, you've got to be perfect, right? You've got to be 2017 New Orleans Saints to move the ball consistently on offense.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think you bring up a pretty interesting point, and I guess I would ask to someone who has a pretty surface level understanding of football, why is it that Kirk Cousins has more success under center? Is it a function of or not even under center? Why does it really matter that the Atlanta Falcons ran the offense the way they did? Is it a function of predictability? Is it a function of the fact that Kirk Cousins is better in other situations? If you had to explain it to someone who kind of had a very surface level understanding, what would you say?
I think it really revolves around there's certain things that you can do in the run game when you're under center that it's more, not that you can't do it when you're in shotgun, but it's more difficult, right? And a lot of it is just tied to the run path. It's not it's kind of just geometry, I guess, right? If a running back is running outside zone from under center, you're just going to get a steeper or a less steep angle to the line of scrimmage. Whereas if you're in shotgun, you're running more horizontal off the snap. And that ties into the play action stuff too, right? Because if you're under center, it's easier to sell run than if you're in shotgun, just because it takes longer to develop. You draw people up more. So it really starts with the variety of things you can do well in the run game when you're under center. That's more difficult to do in shotgun.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I think just points to how much of a cat and mouse game this is. Of so much of football is trying to predict what the other team's going to do, how they're going to line up, are they going to pass, are they going to run? And we know there's varying degrees of success. I shouldn't say we know. There are varying degrees of success when a team is expected to run the ball. They are not as strong running the ball as when the team is expected to pass, and vice versa. The relationship's a little bit different. Teams are a little bit better passing when, comparatively speaking, when defenses know that they're passing. But I think it illustrates kind of a lot of these kind of where the film and data kind of marry together and kind of frame a conceptual understanding of how the game can play out and how it actually bears out in the data.
Yeah. Real quickly on Atlanta before we flip over and I get your thoughts on the Philly offense. I do think it's a good Bijan spot. My worry is Atlanta is down and it's going to be hard to run, but Bijan played 50 offensive snaps in week 1 compared to 10 for Algier. So that's more of a true bell cow role than what we saw from him in his rookie season. And I talked about it last week. I had concerns about the Philly run defense. I was on Jacobs. That was looking very shaky in the early going. He had like 8 carries for 10 yards. He ended up getting there. But if you look at just the total numbers from the Green Bay run game, rushing offense against Philly, they averaged 7.9 yards per carry. And I know there's some noise in there with the Jaden Reed end around and that stuff, but they were ripping off explosive against the Eagles run defense. And if the Falcons are going to try to protect Cousins, you do it with the run game in addition to what you're doing in the passing game. So I think whether it's running, whether it's quick outlets in the passing game, I kind of like the combined rushing and receiving stuff for Bijan this week.
Yeah, I think that's a great angle. And even just to kind of add more data to that, the Falcons, to use our Passover expected metric that we referenced earlier, that is adjusting for situation, when they were trailing last week, they ran the ball 10% more than expected. This is a team that still, I think, is going to give him the ball. And unless the game script gets completely out of control, I still do think that they're going to give the ball to him. And for all we know, that's like the path to success. Of like, if you think about if I tell the story of how the Falcons are going to win this game, I think it's exactly that. Of like playing a much slower game, relying on the run, having like sprinkling in some deep passes by getting the safeties to come down because the Falcons are having success. I see that as a certainly viable game path. And even if not, so long as the game doesn't get completely out of hand and it's still only a 6.5 point game, it's not like a 14-point game, I still think there should be plenty of volume for Bijan. Plus,
Bijan is a top 5 player in the NFL to watch right now. So,
and that's what counts.
It's enjoyable. You spoke a little bit about game script. Do you think the game script gets out of hand because Philly's putting up a lot of points against this Atlanta defense?
So it's an interesting question. I think that Jalen Hurts has some pretty drastic splits depending on whether he's under pressure or not, and even like if they're running cover 0 or not. And the Falcons don't have a particularly high rate of cover 0. It's also like new coaching, so you want to put not too much stock in kind of the week 1 data. But I think this is a Falcons pass rush, which took a step forward. And last year, they were one of the worst in the league. They obviously brought on Matthew Judon, who's a great pass rusher by all means. But I think they're still kind of in that like below average tier. And getting to our discussion in the Saints-Cowboys game, I think the Eagles still have a like pretty clear offensive advantage there. And to me, that's like exactly the spot where Hurts is going to have success. And we saw it last week of just like A.J. Brown can take any ball to the house. And that's kind of how the Eagles want to run their offense. I think there are going to be more opportunities for that, just given the like schematic creativity of Kellen Moore, at least relative to what they had last season, of just like, I think there are going to be more big plays. And that's exactly how a game script can get out of hand, is if you start to stack up some explosive plays one after the other. But I think the Eagles can win in multiple ways, and they can. And that's what kind of makes them such an appealing team, is that if they get up to a lead, they can front run you. They can run with Barkley well. The Falcons do have a good run defense, but I'm not sure that's going to matter against we're running on like year 3 of a like incredible Philadelphia rush offense and just like run blocking in general. I mean, Miles Sanders had like 1,000 yards with these guys, especially running outside the tackles with Lane Johnson and Jordan Mailata. It's just like almost a cheat code in addition to Hurts' mobility. All that is yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say Miles Sanders in Carolina right now is that Wolverine meme where he's laying in bed.
Literally.
Yeah.
That was a good under for last off season. But like they have so many pathways to success. And I think that's what like makes them such an appealing bet, is that they don't need a particular game script to succeed. They can win in multiple different ways, in multiple different types of game scripts, that they have such a high floor that I'm perfectly fine to back the Eagles here. And I'm certainly thinking that they will have success one way or another. The question is like, does it come down to the final drive, or are they kind of playing from 2 scores ahead?
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. I think the Eagles offense is going to roll in this game, specifically Hurts, Brown, Smith, and just to kind of put some numbers behind my reasoning. Falcons had a 21% pressure rate in week 1 which was one of the lowest marks in the NFL. And you talked about bringing on Judon. He had one pressure. The only player with multiple pressures was Grady Jarrett. Now, the Steelers were doing a lot to kind of mitigate pressure. They had 6+ blockers in on 40% of plays. Fields was over a 50% play action rate. They were moving the pocket. So there was a lot there that the Eagles don't do that the Steelers were doing to kind of mitigate the pass rush. But I still don't really have faith in Atlanta getting home on Hurts at a high rate. And if you just look at Hurts, I have concerns about how Hurts handles pressure. I talked about them a little bit against Green Bay. But when he's inside the pocket, when there is no pressure, the 4 highest graded quarterbacks since 2022 in those situations are Tua, Josh Allen, Mahomes, and Jalen Hurts. So if you give him time and you let him operate from a clean pocket, he's going to pick you apart. And A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are going to get open. And I think the Steelers did not attack the middle of the field at all. We know that the Eagles don't really want to attack the middle of the field at all either. They're going to look outside the numbers to Brown and Smith, whether that's on quick outs or those one-on-one deep shot opportunities. And I think that stuff's going to be open for them in this game.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of tie back to a lot of our discussion of like there are multiple different ways of like winning even one particular matchup. Like an offensive line, you can scheme your way around it. I think to your point, like this is a team that just has the advantage in most angles, and like their best against your best, the Eagles are going to come up on top.
Yeah. So it sounds like we're in alignment on Philly there. I like Brown more than Smith a little bit, primarily because some of that middle of the field stuff, Smith was operating as their primary slot, which was a difference in week 1. Now, they'll still hit him on some of those outbreakers and vertical shots, but I think they're going to look outside, and I think they're going to look to Brown specifically. And then on the other side, I like Bijan for Atlanta.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. More waiting. I think the market's done a pretty good job of adjusting to this game. This I think was 3.5 on the look ahead, and I don't think there are any particular angles. I mean, the market's caught up to the fact that like A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith are good at football, and are going to generate yardage. So I'm not sure there's a particular bet for me, though I can't disagree with any of the angles you discussed. But definitely going to be an interesting game.
All right, well, let's close it out then with 2 different things. We're going to go around the rest of the league and hit on some of the things that we didn't talk about in those 4 games. I'll start out with some of the key insights that I like. And just to explain, key insights is something we're kind of developing at PFF, where we take strength on weakness matchups and use a language model to kind of develop a blurb output around it, right? It's basically meant to aid bettors by giving them short form information on a favorable matchup or an unfavorable matchup for a player. So a couple things, 2 that caught my eye this week. One is Brock Purdy against the Vikings. Purdy he's been first in EPA per play against zone coverage. For the first few weeks, we kind of use a weighted average of prior seasons. We're going to flip over to 2024 next week, but using that framework, first in EPA per play against zone, Minnesota ranks 3rd in zone coverage rate. And then there's also beyond that, the blitz angle, where we talked about it last week. San Francisco absolutely destroys the blitz. And I think Minnesota's defense exceeded expectations last year. But that was mostly against bad offenses. Like I think they confused bad offenses, and good offenses were able to pick them apart a little bit. Now, Purdy, he did play Minnesota last year. It was one of those games without Trent Williams and without Debo that they lost. So he had a touchdown and 2 picks, but he was still up around 9 yards per attempt. I think in this matchup with kind of a full complement of weapons, San Francisco is going to have their way with Minnesota.
Yeah, and he was playing that game with a concussion, I believe.
Yeah, I forgot that.
I think, one of the not so subtle secrets from last season. I think I'm higher on Minnesota, but to your point of like, he's first in EPA against zone, he's first in EPA against the blitz. Like when you kind of have like dominant offense going up against defense, like you take the dominant offense, and this team can score so many points.
Yeah. The other one I had, which I'm aware I'm not going too in the weeds with either of these. I'm kind of highlighting obvious things, but Amon-Ra St. Brown is targeted at the 4th highest rate among wide receivers against the blitz. Buccaneers blitz at the 2nd highest rate. And to box score scout for a little bit, in 2 games against the Lions last year, because they played him in the playoffs and the regular season, he caught 20 of 27 targets for 201 yards and 2 touchdowns. And I when you look at how these teams match up, that makes sense kind of fundamentally, that targets are going to get funneled to Amon-Ra St. Brown because the Bucs are sending pressure. He's one of those guys who runs so many of those underneath option routes. And what the Bucs like to do formationally on defense is when Detroit gives them these heavier personnel looks, Tampa Bay is one of the teams more than most defenses in the league who wants to stay in base defense. So you're going to get these favorable matchups over the middle of the field with St. Brown in these zone windows that Detroit is so good at hitting. I know he had a quiet game in week 1 against the Rams. I would imagine that changes here.
Yeah, I haven't seen a price open, but I'd be curious if the market downgraded him at all. I would just add to that, like, the Tampa Bay blitzes a ton, and Amon-Ra St. Brown has I think it's a 32% target rate against blitz. I think that's a great angle to attack. Should we do some SGPs?
What SGPs are you cutting up this week?
Okay, so we're back to giving SGPs from across the league some angles I like. We mentioned one to start with. I'll just very quickly recap. I think that given the matchup that New Orleans has against the man-heavy Dallas team, and especially if this kind of mini hypothesis, I'm not even going to call it a little thesis here, on Clinton Kubiak is true, that he can schematically get around mitigating pressure, then I think that the Saints winning through the pass and through Chris Olave is a very, very appealing angle. And that's been in something like Carr, alts, Olave, alts, and the Saints to win. You're obviously going to get some pretty juicy odds on that, considering they are 6.5 point underdogs. But we already discussed that. Let's get kind of into some other spots. I'm going to back the Giants. I'm going to back Daniel Jones, and I'm going to back the Giants. I think both. But look, this is how we do it here. We don't take the consensus view. You got to stick to the data, stick to some of these tail spots. I think the consensus is the Giants were terrible. The Vikings are nothing special. It's just a repeat of what we saw last year. I think that Daniel Jones struggles against the blitz, and I think that the Vikings defense is way better than the market's currently pricing. He had quick pressure about 40% of the snaps. Quick pressure is pressure that comes within 2.5 seconds. That's generally the time when a quarterback has enough time to process, but that's how we define quick pressure here. That's not going to be true this week. This is a Washington pass. It's an anemic Washington pass rush. And why that matters is, one, because the sample size of plays in which Daniel Jones is going to be under quick pressure versus not is going to be, I think, a lot less than last week, i.e. he's going to have more of these clean plays, so to speak. And obviously your production is going to be a lot better when you are not dealing with quick pressure than when you are. But it kind of couples with the fact of Daniel Jones' biggest strength, no matter his struggles, is his ability to throw the ball deep. And he's been, last year I think was his he was only top 15. His other seasons he's been top 10 in PFF deep grade every single season. And when he has time to throw, and I anticipate him having a lot more time to throw this week than last week, again because this is such a dreadful Washington pass rush, I think they're going to take some deep shots. And it's we didn't learn anything new about the Giants. This was all in the realm of possibilities. This was along the distribution. It was one of his bad games. We've also seen spots where Daniel Jones can put up a ton of yards. And I think that's through the deep passing game. And this is the perfect matchup for it. On the flip side of the ball, Washington, I think they're going to struggle with the Giants pass rush, which, by the way, I think was pretty surprisingly good against what should be a pretty stout Minnesota offensive line. And chart these pressure disruptions. I think we talked about this last week, but these are basically plays which pressure comes. It's similar to quick pressure, but a little bit different. Plays where pressure arrives such that the quarterback cannot go through his progressions or reads on time. They were 4th last week. And I think that's like not a coincidence. They have some really good on talent pass rush. And like, I'm still not buying Jaden Daniels as this like great pocket awareness evader guy. And like the 2 through 52 in Washington is a disaster. Talk about bad wide receiving options. Speaking of the Falcons, we got Olame Zaccheaus as like the second option here. I think this is an offense that's going to struggle. They play with a ton of pace, which matters here because I think that can lead to a lot of play volume. I just see this as a spot of like if Daniel Jones has time to throw, it's not the same Daniel Jones as week 1. The market has sold off hard. His passing yards have dropped a lot. I think you can get something like a Daniel Jones 275 and a Giants like 5.5. You can even go 7.5, ranging from like 20 to 30 to 1. I think it's just a great get right spot. Am I crazy?
No, I the reasoning is sound, right? I am pessimistic about the Giants offense, but I am more pessimistic about the Commanders defense. So this is the spot to do it. I was watching that Tampa Bay Washington game last week, and I'm like, man, you talked about the pass rush struggling. It's like it's hard to believe that they struggle that much when you have the pieces they do on the interior, right? And then the rest of the defense is wolf. So it's the spot for it, man. If you're on a bounce back game, this is the time to do it.
That's right. You could not be any lower than this team right now. All right, the next and third spot here is going to be Deshaun Watson to Amari Cooper. Now, Deshaun Watson was really, really terrible. He did make some throws, but was not a particularly great game. Again, like this was a Dallas pass rush, which was like absolutely dominating the Cleveland front. I don't think we're going to have that with Jacksonville. And what's particularly intriguing about this spot to kind of talk back to our man and zone angles is that the Jaguars played 75% man coverage last week, which is just absolutely insane against Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. I'm totally shocked, by the way, that Tua threw for like 350 yards or whatever, and Hill and Waddle each had over 100 yards. Completely shocking. That's what's going to happen when you play man against these teams. But we have a similar advantage for Amari Cooper, who has been one of the – it's amazing because I feel like he's been in the league for like 12 years already. And somehow I think the answer is actually like 8. But he's been terrific against man. He's got a 31% target share against man, and he has a huge advantage. Darius Williams is going to miss for the Jaguars. They simply do not have the personnel. If it's like whatever a 31-year-old or 30-year-old Ronald Darby's got against Amari Cooper, that's a huge matchup advantage. I think the Browns are going to have more time to throw. We've seen Cooper on these deep balls, especially at the end of last season. Not that much, I think, needs to go right for him to kind of go over those yardage. And if the market's going to sell a little bit on this passing attack, I'm going to buy back in a spot where there is such a huge advantage for Amari Cooper.
Yeah, I think on initial watch through that Browns-Cowboys game, I was just kind of with everyone else. Like, Deshaun Watson is terrible. Like, he's not the same dude. But I cut it when I went back and rewatched. I cut him a little bit of slack because that pass rush was in the backfield the entire game. And we talked about with Dallas, between sacks and quarterback hits, he got hit 18 times. And I don't think Jacksonville is going to be able to do that. And I kind of like where you're going with this one.
Yeah, that's look, we're back in spots of guys that had poor week ones, but it's like there's a lot of path dependency in football. Of like games could go very different under certain situations, or players can perform different if you kind of like change one slight thing. Just like Daniel Jones is not going to be the same quarterback when he's quick pressured 40% of the time than when that number is closer to 20%. And that's sort of the angles we're going to hit. I think that's 3. I think that's hopefully plenty to make us all a bunch of money. As always, you can on Sunday mornings at PFF.com, I will have written up kind of as we get more pricing, as do more of the late week research. We'll have some more same game parlays, but a couple of tails angles to consider, and even some more I think we discussed in the matchups of this game.
Let's ride with Daniel Jones this weekend, man.
What can go wrong?